Thank you everyone for joining us for today's Brown Bag. Our speaker today is Dr. Brian McDonald, who is a recent recipient of the 2019 PCASE Award, which is the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers. Dr. McDonald is a research scientist at the Cooperative Institute of Research in Environmental Sciences, CIRES, at the University of Colorado, working at the NOAA Earth Systems Research Laboratory in Boulder, Colorado. Prior to arriving in Colorado, he received his Ph.D. in environmental engineering and master's in public policy from the University of California, Berkeley. His expertise is on constructing emission inventories, assessments of long-term air quality trends, and regional weather chemistry modeling. So I'm pleased to introduce Brian McDonald.
Thank you for the opportunity to give this brown bag seminar today. So today I'll talk about efforts we've been doing to quantify emissions from the use of oil and natural gas. And let's see. Let's see, I cannot, oh, there we go. So I'd like to start with this graph here about trends in US energy consumption. This comes from the Department of Energy, and there's a few things to point out here. One is that the US is a fairly energy-rich nation, so roughly 95% of the domestic energy production can account for the US consumption. And then over time, in general, there's been an increase in the use of petroleum natural gas. And projections by 2050 are that petroleum is supposed to increase and then decrease by 2050, but the natural gas component is supposed to grow roughly 50% by 2050. And what's interesting is if you look at where oil and natural gas is used, so most of it goes, well, the largest source of oil and natural gas usage goes to as fuel. So natural gas is used to fuel buildings, industry. We largely use gasoline and diesel to power our transportation sector. But there's also a fraction of oil and natural gas that's used for non-fuel purposes, and they're used to make plastic and rubber, and also what we've termed volatile chemical products, or things like everyday chemical products that we use, things like pesticides, coatings, inks, adhesives, personal care products, and cleaning products. And so just overall, one of the benefits from the use of oil and natural gas is that you can switch power plants from coal to natural gas, and this lowers the emissions intensity, so the amount of CO2 that's emitted per kilowatt hour of electricity produced. Also reduces some of the co-emitted air pollutants on an emission intensity basis, including for NOx and SO2. However, there's a lot of questions about potential leaks of methane from just the extraction and production process in these fields. And methane is also a potent greenhouse gas, and there was a recent study suggesting that the emissions of the methane from these oil and gas fields was comparable to the 20-year radiative forcing of carbon dioxide from natural gas combustion. So it's important to figure out what the emissions are in these fields. Another, as I mentioned, transportation is a fairly important use of oil and natural gas, mainly to power the transportation sector or other mobile sources. And when we talk about mobile sources, we're talking about 230 million cars, 3 million freight trucks that are in the US. You're also talking about other engines that can move around, things like locomotives, ships, construction equipment, and also little two-stroke, four-stroke gasoline engines are also considered mobile sources as well. And so if you look at the overall budget, so mobile sources account for maybe 30% of the carbon dioxide emissions, around 50% of the carbon monoxide emissions. 60% of nitrogen oxides, and roughly half of the black carbon in the US. And this is important because these emissions can potentially contribute to air quality challenges that many of the US cities see. So this is just a picture of classic summertime photochemical smog that occurs in Los Angeles, but also occurs in other cities around the US. And these issues are also present in the wintertime. This is a picture of the Salt Lake City basin, where when you have this capping inversion, you can actually trap the air pollution close to the surface, and there can be high fine particle matter production that goes on. And just sort of the last thing to set the stage here is one of the ingredients that contributes to this are volatile organic compounds. And these, you can think of volatile organic compounds as just volatile, meaning that it wants to get into there, and organic compounds just mean that it's got a hydrocarbon backbone to it. And our traditional thought of where these VOCs come from is, one, you get VOCs that are emitted in these oil and gas fields from the extraction of oil and natural gas. You can also get VOC emissions from petrochemical facilities or industrial facilities. VOCs can be emitted from the tailpipe of vehicles. Sometimes if you smell gasoline out of your car, that's really the VOCs. And that can come out of not just the transportation sector, but also these small 2-stroke, 4-stroke type engines, for example, things like lawn equipment. But what was surprising to us is when we went through this mass balance of the petrochemical industry, we found that actually one of the largest sources of VOCs, especially in the urban atmosphere, were from these everyday chemical products that we're using. So again, pesticides, coating inks, adhesives, cleaning products, and personal care products. And that was surprising to us just because a relatively small fraction of oil and natural gas is used to make these everyday chemical products that we're using, but it can contribute roughly half of the VOCs to the atmosphere. And so in this talk, I really want to focus on a particular couple aspects of the system. So there's emissions associated with production and processing. And so I'll talk about some work we've been doing to quantify NOx, methane, and non-methane VOC emissions in these oil and gas fields. And then I'm going to switch over to talking about efforts to quantify nitrogen oxide and non-methane VOC emissions in cities, because that's where a lot of the oil and natural gas is being consumed. And not only am I going to talk about efforts using that we're doing to build up emission inventories to be able to assess these emissions into the atmosphere, but it's also important to check these emission inventories with atmospheric observations that are available. And these days, there's quite a array of assets that can be used to assess these emissions. So one is satellite data right now is starting to get at higher spatial and temporal resolutions that can be able to gain insights on emission sources. There's also aircraft data that we can use, such as the NOAA P3 data during field campaigns. We can also drive around the NOAA Chemical Sciences Division mobile laboratory and gain information on emission sources. And there's also other ground-based assets and monitoring-based approaches to understand both the impacts on air quality as well as gain more insights on emission sources. And then just to orient, if you're not familiar with atmospheric chemistry, the reason we care about nitrogen oxides or NOx and VOCs is because these are the two main ingredients that can contribute to tropospheric ozone as well as secondary organic aerosol. And so you can think of these as the building blocks of photochemical smog in cities, especially in the summertime. And these sources of VOCs in particular have both natural sources, so vegetation can emit VOCs, as well as human activities, such as from transportation, and as I'll talk about, also from buildings. Whereas the nitrogen oxides tend to be mainly coming from human activities such as combustion. So the first topic I'd like to get into is the emissions associated in these oil and gas fields. And so if you look at trends of NO2, so nitrogen dioxide over the US, this is from the OMI satellite for the period from 2007 to 2018. And so the first point is that in general, there's been a decrease in NO2 over much of the US. So you generally see these sharpest decreases in the cities as well as over the Ohio River Valley. And this is because there have been efforts to make power plants cleaner by installing stack scrubbing technologies to remove out the NOx. And then also there have been efforts to reduce tailpipe emissions of NOx from motor vehicles and transportation over time. But there's sort of one area that sticks out here where NO2 is increasing, and one is over West Texas in the Permian. And so next, I just want to dig into, well, what is driving this increase in NOx emissions here? And we're going to approach this from two approaches. One is to perform a regression analysis of that satellite trend and see if it tells us anything about oil and gas activities that are going on in these areas. And then also talk about an independent way of estimating the emissions using a bottom-up fuel-based approach. And then start evaluating the emissions with NOAA P3 aircraft data and see if it is consistent what we see from satellite, and also for trying to estimate things that are more difficult to quantify, things like co-emitted methane and non-methane VOC emissions. And so this is a plot of how oil and natural gas activity over the Permian has trended between 2007 and 18. And so what you're seeing here is in the top left is the trend in production of oil. And what you notice is that oil production in the last 3-4 years in the Permian has grown by roughly a factor of 4 to 5. Similarly, natural gas usage in a short amount of time has grown by a factor of roughly 4. There's also emissions that can be associated with drilling, and this tends to be more variable and may be driven more by the price of oil. And then also you could get NOx emissions from flaring. So where there is production of oil and natural gas, but the infrastructure isn't there to pipe the natural gas to consumers, then one thing you can do is flare that natural gas and keep the oil. And so this is work by my colleague, Barbara Dix at the University of Colorado Boulder. And what she has done is she looked at the satellite trend of NO2 using OMI, and that's shown by the blue line here. And what she did was using those trends in drilling and oil production and natural gas production, she attributed what part of this trend is due to the drilling component, what portion is due to the production of oil and natural gas. So the production piece is shown in gray, the drilling piece is shown in purple. And the other thing to note is that in these oil and gas fields, the background NO2 is a significant fraction of the total. So you don't see as strong an enhancement in NO2 over these oil and gas fields than you do over a city or a power plant. Nonetheless, there's enough the increase over this time cannot be explained by changes in the background levels. Instead, it seems to be due to the production of oil and natural gas, as well as the drilling for that oil and natural gas. And what Barbara also did was to separate out that NO2 component that was due to drilling and the NO2 component that was due to production. And so what this just means is that in these fields, you have to consume energy to extract oil and natural gas out of the ground. And then once that well has been dug, there's also energy that's associated with producing that oil and natural gas. And when you are using engines in these fields, that engine is consuming fuel, but it's in that process is also emitting NOx. And what Barbara has shown is that over time, you may have gotten more NOx from that drilling phase than the production phase, but in the more recent years, because of this scaling up of oil and natural gas production, that the production phase may be as significant as the drilling phase. And so next I want to dig into this a little bit more from a emissions and inventory approach. And so more generally, how you calculate emissions, which with a methodology called bottom-up approaches, is you need some activity of the emission source. So in this case, I'm going to use fuel usage statistics that are available of the oil and gas industry specifically. So in the drilling or exploration phase, there's a lot of diesel engines that are used to extract that oil, and so there's off-road diesel fuel use sales that are available. For the production phase, there's a bunch of combustion engines in these fields, things like dehydrators, heaters, compressors that are largely using natural gas that's consumed on site. And then you also have natural gas processing plants, and there are CO2 emissions available at a facility level from EPA's greenhouse gas inventory. And then to estimate NOx emissions, you also need an emission factor, or how much NOx is emitted per, say, kilogram of carbon dioxide that's emitted. And we've used largely emission factors that are available from EPA, as well as performed a literature review for these emission factors. And then for larger facilities, some of them may have continuous emission monitors on them. And so I've had two students work with me to map out these oil and gas emissions of NOx. And to date, we've been able to map quite a range of basins across the US. So the areas shown span from Texas up to the Bakken, as well as parts of the Marcellus in the northeastern US. And in total, these areas account for roughly 80% of US and oil gas production. And the boxes indicate areas where the NOAA P3 has flown as a part of two field campaigns, one that occurred in 2013 called the Southeast Nexus Study, and the other was a field campaign that occurred in 2015 called the Shale Oil and Natural Gas Nexus Study. So the point here is that half of these basins have ways of deriving emissions just using the aircraft itself. And the way you can derive the emissions in these oil and gas fields using aircraft data is you fly the aircraft in a way where you get this upwind segment at the bottom here, and you crisscross the field, and then you see what the enhancement in methane is at that downwind leg at the top. You need to know what the planetary boundary layer height is, or the cap on top of that. And then from that, you can back out what the emissions are over these fields. And so between the Senex and Songnex campaign, my colleague Jeff Peischel here at the NOAA Chemical Sciences Division has estimated the methane flux from 9 oil and gas basins, shown in the previous map. And from that methane, you can also derive what the NOx emissions are from oil and natural gas. And the way that you can do that is you look over these fields and remove the influence from potential point sources that could be a big source of NOx, as well as cities. And what you find is that when you look at the measurements of total reactive nitrogen, or NOI, and compare and correlate that with methane, you see these consistent relationships between NOI and methane. So if you've measured the flux of methane, that actually tells you the flux of NOI that's associated with oil and natural gas development. And so what we've done here is then to compare this bottom-up emissions inventory, this fuel-based oil and gas inventory that we've developed and mapped across the US, that's shown by the dark blue bars here. We use the aircraft to derive the NOx emissions from the atmospheric perspective, and that's shown by the light blue bars here. And what's nice here is that between these two field campaigns, we're capturing a wide range of basins here. Some basins are predominantly producing oil, others are predominantly producing a dry natural gas. But overall, this fuel-based oil and gas inventory that we've developed for NOx is pretty consistent with all these basins, even though they capture a fairly wide range of the type of combustion engines you might need in these fields, whether it's a dry gas or a wet gas. So what's also interesting is when we've looked at the aircraft data from the NOAA P3, again, looking at this NOI to methane relationship, we tend to see a fairly consistent relationship across these basins here. And why would this be? Because NOx is mainly coming from the combustion engines, not necessarily the fugitive leaks of methane or non-methane VOCs. And what we think is going on here is you've got the drilling component where you've got NOx emissions from those large diesel engines, and you can get spurts of methane emissions and non-methane emissions during that drilling phase and well completion phase. And then when you move over to the production phase, it takes energy to produce that energy. So you have a lot of compressor engines that need to deliver that gas. And in that production phase, you could have leaks at various valves. So this is why we think that you have more or less this consistent relationship, because in the drilling phase and the production phase, you have co-emitted methane and non-methane VOCs that are associated with it. And so leveraging this relationship between methane and NOx, so in many of these basins, and half of the basins, you can get aircraft-derived flux of methane. But in some of the basins, the conditions aren't ideal for estimating the emissions from the aircraft. But if we can estimate NOx in these areas and use that relationship between methane and NOx, then we can get a more complete picture of what the methane emissions are in these oil and gas fields. And so when we do this in this upstream component, we get roughly 14 teragrams of methane that's emitted. This is actually in line with a previous study that was published in Science last year, estimating roughly 11 plus or minus 2 teragrams of methane from oil and natural gas in these areas. And so what the point here is that in general, these emissions of methane in these oil and gas fields are significant. They drive quite a bit of the fraction of methane emissions across this infrastructure from the production and processing phase down to the distribution phase. And what this Alvarez study pointed out was that if the emissions of methane are really at this level, then that is comparable to the 20-year radius forcing of carbon dioxide from just combusting the natural gas. And then just lastly, for completeness, not only is methane emitted in these fields, but there can be non-methane VOCs that are emitted. And one thing, so while the methane to NOI relationship may be more or less consistent across these areas, the type of VOCs that are emitted are not. So in more wet areas with wet gas, you tend to see larger proportions of non-methane VOC emissions relative to methane. This is work by my colleague Jessica Gilman in the NOAA Chemical Sciences Division. And as you get to these drier basins, things like places like the Marcellus, you tend to get a lower fraction of non-methane VOCs relative to methane. And also the composition can vary quite a bit, where you tend to get more aromatics in the wet areas, whereas you tend to get more light alkanes in the dry areas. So the point is that the non-methane VOCs across these basins vary quite a bit. And this is where NOAA P3 measurements across these areas have been quite valuable in quantifying this aspect. So just to summarize, in general, there's been increasing tropospheric NO2 columns viewed from satellites over some oil and gas regions, especially the Permian in West Texas. There's been some rapid oil and natural gas production that's occurred in the last few years, which is why we see these increases in the NO2 column over these oil and gas fields. And this enhancement, we think, is due to the combustion engines that are required for drilling and oil and natural gas production. And we've tried to come up with bottom-up approaches for estimating the NOx emissions, which we think are fairly consistent with the NOAA P3 aircraft measurements that occurred between 2013 and 15. And we hope that the use of NOx may provide an additional constraint of potential leaks of methane emissions in these fields. So next, I want to talk about questions that have arisen in the transportation sector. So in cities, mobile sources are a major source of NOx. And there's been several summer field campaigns, including the NOAA Senex campaign in 2013, that suggested when you looked at the aircraft data and compared it with emissions of mobile source NOx that was being reported by the US Environmental Protection Agency, it seemed like the emission inventories, the official inventories, were overestimating NOx. But then there were several studies that came over during winter field campaigns that occurred that suggested when you looked at the aircraft data and compared it with mobile source NOx inventories, again from EPA, that there wasn't an overestimate. And this is, these two realities can't exist with one another, because in general, for nitrogen oxide emissions, it's not generally thought that the emissions from mobile source engines varies much between seasons, unlike for things like carbon monoxide and VOCs, where you tend to have more VOCs, say in the wintertime. It takes longer for your car to warm up, to heat up, and it takes longer for that three-way catalytic converter to work. So CO and VOCs are expected to be, emissions are expected to be higher from transportation in the wintertime versus the summer, but that's not expected to be for NOx. So the only thing that can really reconcile this is there a seasonal dependence in these mobile source NOx emissions that we're unaware of? And so to try and answer this question, going to look at this from a couple approaches. Again, using bottom-up methods to estimate mobile source NOx emissions, much in the way that we've done for oil and gas. And then also to leverage satellite data, which can measure between these two seasons and see is there observational evidence for these mobile source emissions that can explain this. And so the approach we've used to estimate the emissions, again, is for the activity component, we look at fuel sales that are available from the US Department of Transportation. For these off-road engines, there are surveys of the off-road gasoline and diesel engines. So off-road engines mainly being things like construction equipment and also farm equipment. And in the US, gasoline is mainly consumed by light-duty passenger vehicles and diesel mainly heavy-duty trucks. And the nice thing about fuel sales is that it's reported annually and by state. So the second half of the equation is looking at an emission factor. So the NOx emissions in the grams of NOx that's emitted per kilogram of fuel. And so what's being shown here are trends in NOx emission factors from gasoline vehicles in green, diesel vehicles in blue. So again, green is mainly light duty vehicles in the US and blue is from heavy duty vehicles. And each of these points represents a near roadway study that's been performed over the last 30 years. And a lot of this work has come from the University of Denver. Sometimes if you're at least in the Colorado area, and I think also in Virginia, they may have this tailpipe infrared remote sensing beam that they point across, and they are able to measure the emission factors for individual vehicles that are driving by. And so we had done a study looking at the aircraft data in 2013 from the NOAA Senex campaign. And our explanation for why this summertime NOx emissions appear to be overestimated from mobile sources is that if you notice, so the dashed line shows the emission factor from the EPA vehicle emissions model, which is called moves, and when you compared it with these roadway studies, it looked like it was about a factor of 2 higher when these field studies were occurring in this 2011 to 2016 period. However, this doesn't really explain what's going on in the winter time. And one thing I'll point out is that if you look at the heavy duty truck NOx emission factors, all the open markers show studies that have occurred in California. And if you notice, almost all the studies from 2000 of these near roadway experiments have occurred for the trucks in California. And one thing that you notice in California, since I did my PhD there, is that it has relatively mild winters there, whereas in other parts of the US, it can be quite a bit colder in the wintertime. And there's only been one recent winter-summer tunnel study that occurred in Baltimore in these last few years. And what they noticed is if you looked at the emission factors of NOx for the transportation sector between winter and in summer, that the winter emission factors tended to be about a factor of 2 higher. And so what I'd like to do here is now look at some satellite data to be able to discern whether there's really evidence for differences in mobile source emissions between the winter and in the summer. And then one of the reasons that satellite data is quite useful is because it's hard to get a field study to occur both in the winter and in the summer in the same place. But the appeal of the satellite data is that it's always there and is potentially a useful resource to be able to assess especially patterns between seasons. And so this is work by my colleague Meng Li. Here she is showing the NO2 column over the US. This is from a recent satellite that was launched called Tropomi. These are results at 12 kilometer by 12 kilometer resolution for the period of July 2018. And what you notice, if you look at this satellite retrieval of NO2, that the hotspots of NO2 are over these cities and can be also over some large power plant facilities. And so what we've done here is compared our NOx emissions that we've developed for the mobile source sector using the fuel-based approach that we've talked about previously. We updated power plant emissions of NOx because there actually have been quite significant decreases in NOx emissions in power plants over the last few years. And then we updated other sources of NOx from the National Emissions Inventory reported in 2014. So the point here is we've tried to get the best estimate of NOx emissions that we could for this period in 2018. And when we compare this, our inventory and modeling with what's seen by the Tropomi satellite, In general, we are in pretty good agreement with that tropospheric NO2 column observed by troposphere. And also, if we zoom in on cities such as the New York City region, we're also within 20% of the satellite retrieval, which is roughly the uncertainty of the emissions inventory and also the satellite NO2 column. So in general, a reasonable agreement between our best estimate of the nitrogen oxide emissions with the satellite data during the summertime. And just as another check, there were a bunch of ground-based spectrometers that were located in the Long Island Sound area during this July 2018 period. And when we model these NOx emissions in the Weather Research and Forecasting with Chemistry model, or WRF-Chem, we also get relatively good agreement between our inventory and model with these ground-based spectrometers. So we're pretty confident that we're doing a reasonable job of estimating these NOx emissions in the summertime. However, the hypothesis here is that if NOx is really underestimated in the wintertime, then if we don't have a seasonal dependence in mobile source NOx, then we should underestimate NO2 in the model quite significantly relative to troposphere. And this is a picture of the NO2 columns from troposphere in the wintertime. This is from March of 2019. One thing you notice is that the NO2 columns are much stronger in the wintertime than in the summer. This actually has more to do with the lifetime of NO2 in winter is longer than in the summertime. But now if we simulate our best guess of nitrogen oxide emissions and compare it with the troposphere satellite in the wintertime, we see quite a significant underestimate in our model relative to what the satellites is seeing. So what we tend to see is roughly underestimate by 30% or so across the US. And this underestimate is even stronger in areas like northeastern cities, like the New York region, where we're underestimating by 60% now, whereas before we were more or less in the uncertainty range of the satellite and the inventory. And so is it possible that mobile source emissions could close this gap? Well, as that Baltimore study suggested, if the NOx emission factors from mobile sources are potentially underestimated by a factor of 2 in winter, and if mobile source NOx emissions accounts for roughly a third of US NOx emissions, then doubling the emissions from these mobile sources could help close that gap. And what are the possible explanations for that? Well, as I mentioned, in the US, the NOx emissions, at least from transportation, mainly come from cars and heavy duty trucks. And so in the US, most of the cars are powered by gasoline. And there was a large study that in the 2000s that didn't see a large difference between winter and summer emission factors. So it's unlikely it's due to the gasoline cars. There's been studies in Europe where they've looked at emission factors from diesel cars and shown that in colder cities, such as Sweden, you do see higher NOx emission factors than you do in warmer cities in Europe, like Athens, Greece. And then there's been some work in the US showing that under certain driving conditions, such as stop and go traffic, you can get higher NOx emission factors from the trucks. And so to the extent that driving occurs in cities, this potentially has a temperature dependence associated because the engine isn't as hot when it's going under stop and go conditions. And this is relevant because if you look at the fine particulate matter that forms in the wintertime in places like Salt Lake City, when you look at the composition of the PM 2.5, the blue shows nitrate. So this would be PM that would form from NOx emissions and undergo oxidation to form nitrate. And so this nitrate formation is a significant fraction. And so to the extent that NOx occurs in cities, it's important to get good estimates of these sources. So to summarize, Current vehicle emission models lack a strong seasonality for NOx emissions. We think that the satellite data can be useful to getting a better handle on whether there's a seasonal dependence, and hopefully motivate some more studies of the near roadway environment to get a better constraint on what is occurring in the wintertime from the tailpipe emissions versus the summer. And just to point out why this matters is that NOx contributes both to summertime ozone and wintertime ammonium nitrate issues. So it affects the air quality in both seasons. And so the last topic I want to talk about is on VOC sources and looking at non-traditional VOC sources such as these volatile chemical products. And so we published our paper last year using data from Los Angeles, but actually there was also a group in Innsbruck, Austria that noticed that there was a large flux of oxygenated VOC emissions that couldn't be explained from fossil fuel sources, and also suggested that these chemical products could be a source. And the overarching question I want to address in this last segment of the presentation is, do the anthropogenic VOCs contribute to ozone exceedances? Because our conception is that in areas of the eastern US where you have a lot of vegetation, you do have a lot of isoprene emissions. And to be able to answer this question, first, we're going to quantify what the anthropogenic VOC emissions are using recent field measurements that the NOAA Chemical Sciences Division made in New York City, and then also use a chemical transport model to model the impacts on ozone during a heat wave in New York. And so last year, the NOAA Chemical Science Division performed a small field experiment, both in the wintertime and the summertime. We brought with us our advanced VOC instrumentation and put this instrumentation on top of, as a ground site, on top of the engineering building in City College of New York, where there's a NOAA CREST Center, and City College of New York is located in Upper Manhattan. We also put this instrumentation on our mobile laboratory and drove around the city. And I want to especially acknowledge my colleagues who performed the experimental work here. And so again, the approach to estimate the emissions of VOCs is to first figure out how much fuel is being consumed in New York. And so there's statistics on gasoline and diesel fuel sales, also for the off-road gasoline and diesel engines. We also looked at natural gas that's consumed in buildings, especially in the wintertime in Manhattan. And then also we know roughly how much volatile chemical products people use. And we think that these roughly scale with population across the US. So with the fuel use, then we need an emission factor to estimate the VOC emissions. And so in our paper last year, we quantified what these emission factors were. So this is the emission factors in grams of VOC emitted per kilogram of product. This is on a log scale, and the thing to note here is that the yellow bars, these are the emission factors from volatile chemical products, are roughly 1 to 2 orders magnitude higher than that third bar to the left, which is the VOC emission factor from the tailpipe of a modern day passenger vehicle. So it doesn't take a lot of chemical product use to have an outsized influence on VOC emissions in the urban atmosphere. And so if we combine those fuel use statistics with those emission factors, we can derive this pie chart on the left of VOC emissions in New York City. On the right is what we published for Los Angeles last year. And the thing to note here is that the orange and blue part, or orange and brown parts of the pie chart, so these are the emissions associated with volatile chemical products, is a fairly sizable fraction of the total, both in New York City and in Los Angeles. To be able to compare these emissions with our ambient measurements that we make in New York City, we can't just look at the VOC total, but we have to see what are the individual VOCs that are emitted. And the one thing to note is, so here is the composition of VOCs from fossil fuel sources on the left, and then volatile chemical products on the right. And notice that the volatile chemical products have a lot of red fraction here. And this red fraction denotes the VOC emissions that are oxygenated in nature. Things like alcohols, ketones, esters. The reason that volatile chemical products are oxygenated is that a lot of these products are water soluble, so you want these type of compounds in there. Whereas you don't see a lot of oxygenated compounds in the fossil fuel sources, except for gasoline, which has 10% ethanol these days. And so on the x-axis, I show ratios of VOC to CO that we measure at our ground site in New York City. On the left axis, I show VOC to CO emissions that we estimate using our inventory. And this is just accounting for emissions from fossil fuel sources. But the point here is that we cannot explain the ambient level of VOCs in Manhattan using fossil fuels alone. So we underestimate what we measure in the ambient atmosphere by 64%. And it's only when we include emissions from these volatile chemical products that we start getting a better agreement with our ambient observations in New York City, and also get a better correlation across all these 30+ species that we measure with our VOC instrumentation. So the last thing I just want to talk about is how we now start putting the pieces of this puzzle together to look at how ozone is impacted. So in the second part of the talk, I've talked about ways of how we've estimated the NOx emissions. And here now we're adding the VOC emissions, and we're performing this modeling across the US at 12-kilometer resolution, and also over the eastern US at 4-kilometer resolution in the regional WRF-Chem model. And this is work I've done with my colleague Stu McKean at NOAA. And so in general, when we model this heat wave episode that occurred on July 2nd, 2018, so our model results are shown by the coloring back in the mapping here, and the dots represent the air quality monitors that are routine monitors that EPA has. And in general, the model agrees pretty well with the spatial distribution of ozone here. And the main point is that during these heat waves, you get quite a bit of area in where you have levels of ozone that can be unhealthy. And so in this area, areas that are shown in orange, red, and purple show using the air quality index where ozone may be unhealthy for sensitive populations. So roughly 25 million people over this area. And then we've also tested where we just turn on and off the anthropogenic VOC emissions. And you notice this hotspot that's located just north and downwind of Manhattan on this day. And so you can get an impact of 30 parts per billion on the 8-hour ozone maximum. Consider that the standard is 70 parts per billion of 8-hour ozone maximum. So 30 ppb is not a trivial fraction. And my colleague Matt Coggin has performed some source apportionment using box modeling techniques. And what he finds is of this anthropogenic contribution, roughly half is due to mobile source VOC emissions, and the other half from these VCPs. So to summarize, we think that these emissions of volatile chemical products are important in New York, much like in Los Angeles, so roughly half of that anthropogenic VOC total, and that they are contributing to exceedances of ozone during things like heat waves. So roughly half from mobile source VOCs and the other half from VCPs. So I'd just like to acknowledge many of my colleagues here who really performed a lot of this work between NOAA and CIRES at the University of Colorado Boulder, as well as some of the international collaborators in the Netherlands, and also the funding sources, including a NASA ACMAP award for the oil and gas work, and the NOAA Cooperative Institute agreement, and a CIRES innovative research proposal, which funded a lot of the urban work. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you so much for that great presentation. we do have an online question, so if anyone else has a question, please go ahead and submit that now. But this first person would like to know, considering the uncertainty in the methane emissions and the scattering in the NOI versus methane plot, what's your estimate for the uncertainty in NOx emissions for the oil and natural gas operation using the NOx to methane ratio?
Yeah, so we think it's somewhere between, for the NOx emissions piece, we're talking uncertainty about 30%, and then for the scatter, I would think that I would add another 10 or 20% to that. So the other thing we can do to try and reduce this uncertainty in our emissions is taking leverage of that Tropomi satellite. So one of the things about the Tropomi satellite is that it measures both NO2, methane, as well as formaldehyde. So formaldehyde is a potential diagnostic for the VOCs. And so the next step will be to see this relationship in the P3 aircraft between NOI and methane. Do we see a similar type of relationship in the satellite Tropomi data for NO2 and methane? And so that might help reduce this scatter in that relationship.
Great, and I'm not seeing any more online questions at the moment, but if anyone has any additional comments or questions, we'll be sure to put you in touch with Dr. McDonald. So just want to thank everyone for attending, and thank you, Dr. McDonald.
Thank you for having me.
All right, goodbye.